Welcome, everybody. We are excited that we've made it to day 4, and two of the modules that we're going to be covering today are some of the most important ones, those tools, prevention tools, and debriefing. And so what we're going to be doing this morning as part of the welcome and focus on the past modules is just to cover kind of some summaries of yesterday's session. We've already covered 3 times now the focus on leadership, on assumptions, on neurobio, and on trauma-informed care and risk factors. So we're going to be moving now to just a summary of yesterday. So Kevin, you want to start with some of your presentations or yesterday?
Sure. Well, yesterday I did our experiences at Bridgewater State Hospital. And I guess the only thing I really want to say about that is that if we could do this at Bridgewater State Hospital, you can do it anywhere. It was the most violent place I'd ever worked. We had to do this work under a lot of scrutiny by the governor's office, the Department of Correction, Protection and Advocacy, NAMI, family members, because everybody had been led to believe that this was going to kind of be flicking a light switch, and all of a sudden Bridgewater would just turn from a prison into a hospital, which of course is not how that works. So it was kind of like working in a fishbowl with people just kind of second guessing everything we were trying to do. We had the enormous challenge of taking over a facility where about 400 staff had to be retrained immediately. And then many of them left because they either were scared about the correctional officers leaving, or they just wanted to work in Department of Corrections. So besides having to train all these people up front, then we ended up having to hire about 400 to replace the people that left. So the turnover was tremendous and every bit as serious as what we've seen through COVID. The facility was very old. If you haven't seen Bridgewater, then it would be very hard to imagine. But we're talking about just a very old facility, no air conditioning, so the units would get to be in the high 80s and 90s during the day, during the summer. And no group rooms on the unit, very poor line of sight. And we had to get accredited by the Joint Commission in the first year and a half we were there. So that said, the 6 core strategies worked even in an environment like that. It is not perfect yet. And like I said, unfortunately, the people that come into Bridgewater are often have been in prison or jails or prisons for quite a while and not getting any medication. So they are pretty decompensated, and it can take months to get them recompensated. And so it's hard to do this work with folks that it's hard to communicate with. So that said, the staff did a tremendous job. You heard from Morgan. She's exactly the kind of shining example of what commitment and compassion and just kind of dogged work every day does. She doesn't make any more money than anybody out in the community. One of our issues at Bridgewater was the competitive salaries that we were trying to deal with, and that's one of the reasons she's right now, out of 3 peers, the only one that's still at Bridgewater while they're trying to hire. So that said, I'm very happy I was involved in that project. It was very difficult. It was very heartwarming at the end. And to see the place now and to talk to the folks there, really every time I go back, just is very heartwarming to see that You don't need a new hospital, and you don't need, you know, you can do this work just, you know, by hard work and diligence and really believing at the end goal. So I guess I'll end there, but I just again just want to say COVID and the pandemic really threw, you know, really threw a monkey wrench into a lot of the really great work everybody was doing across the country. And we're now having to start over in some cases. And that's why we're so super glad that that we've had a really good response to this training. And there's so many of you out there with such excellent questions and and so much interest. So thank you for being a part of this project and this training conference. And I'll go turn it back over to Beth.
Thank you, Kevin. As shared yesterday, I had the gift of spending time with Kevin at Bridgewater and was so impressed when she talks about leadership being the most important of the 6 core strategies. She really exemplified that there in the best possible way. And you also heard, as you remember, from Ken Luter, who is retired now, but who actually did a similar type of transformation, but in a IRTP type of program in New York State, and went in at the worst possible time for a program with, you know, the same kind of fishbowl with, you know, the state on top of them and threatening them, and they were going to lose their license and so many things. And yet Ken, you know, was asked to go in there and take over. He did. And he basically adhered to the 6 core strategies. You can't do them all at once, which Kevin will talk about later in prevention plans, but you do have to attend to all of them over time. And I think that what was most impressive for me, having actually been consulting for the state back then, so being able to be in the program like Kevin was too, was that Ken went in with his values. He really believed in family-driven and youth-guided care for residential. He believed in permanency. He immediately made sure he hired family partner, a youth peer specialist. He immediately changed the practice so that children and adolescents could go home on a regular basis, even if they had to meet worker, like a community worker that was, you know, they were 4 hours away, 5 hours away, they made it happen. And that in and of itself just gave all of the youth and the families such hope. And then I feel like that one of the other pieces that was so important was that he didn't just train in hope. He actually, as you heard, put in a supervision system that administrators were spending time on the floor every evening. Somebody was there and they were giving real-time feedback to staff in a gentle and a kind way, but they established those competencies and then they trained to those competencies, and then they mentored, and then they supervised on a regular basis. So it just shows you that intense amount of work. And I can't remember who was it who shared that, you know, she was opening a new hospital. And so I hope that some of what Kevin talked about and some of what Ken talked about will be inspiring, even though we do think you're going to have to take your vitamins for that. And then I don't think anybody who was on yesterday couldn't actually recap in their own hearts and minds what the 3 panelists said, you know, and what they talked about. And it was great the way, I think his name was Jeffrey, one of the audience members who shared, wow, staff reset, what a great idea, you know, supporting the staff reset, you know, coming from a family member, and all that Morgan shared and Sam shared, and their willingness to, you know, expose their own selves and their experience and their hospitalizations, and for Sam also multiple residential programs. So I think that rather than kind of go through any more about what they shared, just each of us kind of remembering them and thinking like, how can I honor every single person I'm serving So that if they're on a panel in the future, they're going to be saying all these wonderful things that happened from, with all the staff. So I didn't know, Kevin, if you wanted to comment on that panel again, or we'll leave it with,
Yeah.
with that piece. So, so before we begin, then we're going to begin a little bit early today. Does anybody have any comments or questions from any of the modules? We've covered 4 of the 6 modules. We're going to cover debriefing again and prevention tools. The last 2 we're going to cover today. But does anybody have any questions on leadership, on data, on youth and adult consumer and family voice, choice, and roles, on workforce development? Which, to be honest, workforce development is is almost like paired with leadership, because you can't have leadership without that whole focus, as Ken demonstrated yesterday and Kevin did at Bridgewater. So any comments or questions about those 4 core strategies, or anything related to what we've done so far? Okay.
I don't
so
see anything in the chat.
Yeah. Okay. And I have to say, I don't want to embarrass anybody, but for some reason, Angela's right in front of my screen all the time. And she's so nice it's like, so I feel like I'm engaging with you, Angela, when I'm speaking, because you're right there.
Thank you. I enjoy this very much. Thank you.
You're beautiful to see
Oh,
and
thank you.
to engage in. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Because I usually next to you is Kevin, and I'm tired of looking at her. So anyway, okay, so we're going to move. Thank you, Dana, for moving that forward. So we're going to move to one of my very favorite modules, prevention tools. And these are tools to use way before you're even considering de-escalation. They're very, very either upstream, downstream, or upstream. They're upstream. I get down and up mixed up. But they're very upstream. It's what you establish in your program to happen, so that staff have those tools. So next slide, please. I was in a Pennsylvania hospital that actually, and a number of Pennsylvania hospitals had done this. Kevin mentioned them on the very first day in the overview. They had no restraint seclusion in over like 3 years. A couple of them even, I think, went 7 years. And a direct care staff, I asked there on one of the adult units, and I said, how do you think you do this? What do you think you're doing? And this direct care staff answered, oh, and she kind of put her hand in her pocket. She said, we have hundreds of tools. We have so many tools we can use. And so this concept of prevention tools, even though we're only going to cover some of these goals here, there's, like she said, hundreds of tools. And so this module is going to present, as I said, a few of those tools. And remember, trauma, if we go back again, trauma is in the body. You study anything to do with Bessel van der Kolk, and trauma's in the body. And so your job really, and this is coming from me, but not from your competency list, but my view is your job is that you're healers, and you want to support the person who you're serving, the people who you're serving, in learning to self-regulate, okay? So they can move towards recovery and resiliency and skill development and wellness. And so let's hope that these tools will actually support you. And if you're already using them, which I suspect many of you have these in your toolbox. So the next slide, please, is just see if there's anything, because you're listening to this, is there anything that you can actually improve on? Now, when we were talking, when we had that great question on day 2, I believe, is like, do you ever individualize, or can you give examples of how you individualize? One of the examples I gave was the one in Big Spring, Texas. I didn't tell the first part of the story, but it's a very long drive to get to Big Springs. It's like in the middle of nowhere, and you know how big Texas is, everybody. And when I was driving there, I actually got a speeding ticket from a state trooper. But it was the only time ever that I got a speeding ticket. And then the state trooper asked me out to dinner afterwards. So it wasn't such a bad ticket. And anyway, if you remember, I talked to you about the superintendent or the CEO, and he set the stage for every new person that came into that facility. And for this one that I again observed, you know, he really said to the leaders throughout that facility, he said to the leaders, your job with this person is to make sure that he is comfortable and that he's soothed. We're not going to allow him to become dysregulated because we're not paying attention. And so we're going to be covering those soothing plans and triggers. And then Dr. Tina Champagne is actually going to do the sensory modulation part. And I'll say a little bit about her later, but one of your own Massachusetts hospitals, Bournewood, they all went to the 6 core strategy training, all the leadership there. And their CEO went back and shared everybody's responsible to continuing to look at what we can do to prevent the use of restraint and seclusion. So it was the business manager who was looking at supplies bought every month. And he looked at this one unit who had the highest, spent the most money on supplies, sensory supplies. And looked like they were replenishing it every month. And of course, as a business manager, this person was thinking, that's a lot of money. But then he remembered that he had by unit, the percentage and the numbers of restraints over a period of time. This unit continually had the least amount of restraints or seclusions, and often 0. So he started thinking, increasing the use of sensory materials probably has this correlation to reduced use of restraint seclusion. So they shared that with everybody. So really be listening to that part too. Next slide, please. So the most important prevention tool are staff. Next slide. Thank you. And your own staff, long ago, Kathy Fuentes, actually worked and was a leader, nurse manager in a program that eliminated restraint seclusion. And her model was you hire for attitude and train for skill. So you're again hiring, like Ken was talking about, and supervising those staff to core qualities. But she was looking for that attitude, that active supervision towards training for the skill could happen. And then your own Dr. Janice LaBelle presented at a conference in Sweden a number of years ago. And it was an international conference, and all of these different presenters from different countries. And it was for youth and for children and adolescents. And all these different countries had leaders presenting on how they had reduced restraint and seclusion significantly. And this person from Sweden who was hosting the conference, Per Anders Rydelius, I'm not sure I got his name right, but I don't pronounce my ex-husband's names right often either. So he said, these are great. These are just great presentations. And he said, we actually don't restrain or seclude children and adolescents in Sweden. And everybody's like, what? And so somebody raised their hand and said, well, what do you do? And he said, well, we just hire good people. We hire nice people. And so then somebody else raised their hand. They said, what do you do when those people leave? And he said, we hire their friends. So think about some of these kind of foundational tools. And this next one, actually, next one, slide, please, expands upon this. Can you imagine if each of you, think about Kathy Fuentes, who hired for attitude, she's looking at these qualities, right? What if every single person on your unit, 99% of the time even, displayed these qualities? What would happen, do you think, on your unit? What can we do to promote that. That's what Ken was talking about yesterday. He knew he had to get to his staff to get to this place where this was happening all the time. And the panelists talked about, especially those first two, where they actually talked about all of these. And so consider that. I told you about the story in Arizona where the forensic hospital, and when they asked everyone on this one unit of the persons served, you know, what's your major trigger? What are some of your major triggers? It was disrespect. So they just focused on this respectfulness with everybody and with each other. I don't know how many of you have heard of Joel Slack. He is calls himself, or has called himself in the past, a consumer survivor. He's actually provided presentations in Massachusetts over the years, and he had actually won his team in one of the Midwestern states when he was a senior in high school, had won the state championship in basketball, and he got a scholarship to a Division I university to play basketball. But the summer after his senior year, he actually had his first mental health breakdown, and he ended up in a psychiatric hospital and never made it to play Division I. And he continually was in and out of hospitals for many years and was on very tough regime of medication. And he said in this one hospital, he'd been in and out of the system for, I don't know, 15 years. And he said they had this big day room that had both the cafeteria and then kind of a gym area or a play area. And he said he'd kind of walk around the edges of this big room, and he would shuffle. And he says, sometimes, had saliva coming out of my mouth. And he says, I don't know how long I'd been there, months. And he said, all of a sudden, as I'm walking around, one of the fellow clients, a fellow patient, came up and put a basketball in his hand. He said he hadn't touched a basketball in 15 years. And then the fellow patient kept pointing as if and he looks up and there was a rim right up there. And the other patient kept trying to clap and get him to throw the ball. So he threw the ball. It didn't go anywhere, but the other patient retrieved it, whatever they call that. And then he insisted. So he did this 4 or 5 times, and the other patient kept kind of gently pushing him forward, and he finally made it. And then he kept making it. And then the other patient would push him backwards, and he kept making it. And he said he was probably at 3-point line, and he shot the ball. It went in, and he says, all of a sudden he hears all this clapping. The entire cafeteria had been watching him, staff, other patients, or people served, and everybody was clapping. And he said, that was the moment I remembered I have all these strengths, and he says, in all my years of therapy and everything that was happening, that had not come out. So are we spending time really reminding, and I think Sam talked about that a little bit yesterday too, about get people outdoors, get them in the community, even for a walk, to remind them there's life there, there's hope there. And gave the example at one point over the last 3 days about the program. Now many programs have done this, where they have the bulletin board with the pictures of staff and what they love to do, and their interest and passions and strengths. And it's a way of talking to those new persons served coming in, and what do you love to do, and you're going to like this person. So there's so much in just this slide, but we're going to move to the next slide, and we're going to talk about these crisis prevention plans that are also known as soothing plans or calming plans or safety plans. And what is it? I feel like, just like we talked about the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Events study, it's a miracle study, right? It really changed the way we do business. In the same way, these safety plans or soothing plans, I feel it's a miracle. It's helped us begin to provide the people we serve and their family members with an understanding of how they can take what they learn with us and take it home. A very, very simple task. And so, it's therapeutic, it's trauma sensitive, because we're doing those trauma assessments and integrating them. It's partnership, which is what the panelists talked about yesterday. Partner with people. it's owned. It's that consumer voice. It's owned by them, and it's written in a way that they understand, and it provides them strategies. So it is a tool that we have in our toolbox, one of the best tools. Pat Deegan, who was also a consumer survivor and has written a number of books, has shared that she thinks that these prevention plans, and particularly the strategies of them, she goes, that's her personal medicine. It's our own personal medicine. So I know that in Hathaway Sycamores in California, which is a residential program, they have a youth peer is the first person that meets the new youth and or family coming in, and they're the ones right at admission or at pre-admission, if they can do it, that they start the focus on developing the sense the safety plan or the soothing plan. Next step, please. Next slide. I mean, okay, so it's really, as we said, it's very upstream. It's the earliest stages. It's really setting the ground so everybody has this. You want every one of your staff members to know every single person you serve. What are their triggers? What are their warning signs? What are their strategies? It helps staff plan ahead, and it helps them use these interventions that reduce risk and trauma to those we serve. Next slide, please. And here are the essential components, triggers, warning signs, early warning signs and strategies. But sometimes people also put in what not to do, and that can be helpful. I know I was in a hospital in Nebraska, Kearney, Nebraska, actually. And there was the person, young man, actually, like, I don't know, 23 or something, who had the most restraints. And they had individualized rooms in this particular unit. I interviewed him because he had had so many restraints, and I had looked at their documentation and at his record. And basically he was asked at admission, what should we not do when you're upset? And he clearly said, do not offer me medication. It scares me when I'm offered medication. I feel like it's forced, even though it's being offered. And he says, don't let me be alone. Don't have me go to my room. But when you looked at what was happening when he was escalating, is that's what he was being offered. He was being asked, hey, do you want some medication to help you calm down? Why don't you go to your room and calm down? So nobody was really looking at it. So really thinking about how do we incorporate this so that everybody gets it, just like that superintendent, Big Springs, Texas. Okay, next slide, please. And so what are we going to do? We're going to identify those triggers. It sets off an action. Probably all of you are aware of this. How many of you can think of something that triggers you? Is there anything that your significant other has ever done that triggered you? Think about that, But what is that trigger? Could it be bedtime for an individual, or room checks, or large men, people too close? Next slide, please. And here are some of those common triggers. Kevin's going to talk about debriefing later. And I mentioned before, there's a program that they say with their debriefing, they use a trauma lens. And they always ask in this debriefing, what possible trigger did we miss? Was there a trigger? Did we miss? And so these are just, again, common triggers, but we want to ask, we want to give people a list of possible triggers. And then we want our staff, and I'm going to say this maybe 3 or 4 times, to be meticulous observers so that they can understand maybe there's other triggers, because sometimes people don't know what their triggers are, and they'll say something because they heard somebody else say it, or they just want to get over this particular part of the admission process, or sitting down with staff. And sometimes we just don't know. And somebody said that beautifully a couple days ago, but we're constantly, one of the reasons is not so we can know, but we want them to know. We want their family members to know. We want to support the people we serve in increasing their understanding about what has them dysregulate, how's their amygdala start going off. And one program, a clinician shared with us that it was a psychiatric adult hospital, and it was a private, the person had been admitted every November for like 3 years. This person had been coming in. And this new clinician finally thought, wow, look at that, November, that's her birthday. And so she gently, and as your own Janina Fisher, who's been to Massachusetts so many times, she used compassionate inquiry. That's her term, at least I view it as Janina's term. And what she began to disclose the young woman is that, in fact, yes, her uncle used to visit around her birthday every year. When everybody had gone to bed, he'd sneak into her room and he would rape her, and he would threaten if she would tell anybody that it was also going to happen to her sister. And so, what would happen? She'd get dysregulated this time of year. So think of the possible triggers for the people you serve. Ensure your staff are meticulous observers, and think of our own triggers, staff triggers too. Staff must gain a strong competency in this meticulous observation, not only noticing triggers in the environment and the triggers of the people we serve, but what about the triggers of the fellow staff? So also we want to move to, next slide, please, warning signs. What are these early warning signs? And so once we know the triggers, we also, and often people can't even share what their warning signs are. Think about what your warning sign is when you're upset. Think about what it is when you get stressed, and what do you do then to calm yourself down? But these are some signals of distress, these warning signs. So shortness of breath, tightening in the chest. We're not going to see that, but when we talk to people, we'll get to know that. Sweating, agitation, restlessness. So, and there's also, next slide, please, some common warning signs. You might notice this, and this is what people might feel when they begin to lose control early on. And there's also, as you know, this helps, these warning signs also, when they happen regularly and they result in breaking the rules or in escalation or whatever, it begins to also have us begin to think creatively. So in a program another program in Arizona, actually it was a residential program, there were 3 or 4 girls every morning on their unit who refused to get up and go to school. They would not go to school. It wasn't that big of a unit. It was disrupting the unit because staff were having to spend all this time on that. So the clinician for that unit asked the other clinicians and the lead senior clinical staff if we could have a clinician on the unit every morning until this was resolved. And so the clinicians took turns to get there by 7 in the morning to support getting the youth up, to do more individual inquiry, compassionate inquiry, to find out why, why was it that they weren't getting up? And so it's not just getting that warning sign, but also trying to resolve it. We're talking about strategies, but talk about ways that you could do things differently. In a similar situation in a New York State program, a youth wouldn't go to school, wouldn't get up to go to school. And it was only through that inquiry they found out that it really was her medications were such that she just couldn't wake up in the morning and be present and focus. And so basically what they did, because she felt like she needed that medication for many other reasons, is that they arranged for her to go to school late. So think about that. And then a program in another program in New York, but in Syracuse, New York, and it was a youth program, but when the youth would get off the bus, it was in the community to come back from school, the supervisor of the program, the leader of the program, had 3 staff, one stationed at the bus, one stationed kind of at the bottom of the steps going up to the program, and one at the door. And they always had, of course, something baking, cookies or brownies, so they could smell that as they were coming in. And each of those staff would give either a high five or a handshake or ask about something that happened that day. How was that spelling test? Or, hey, did you get to play basketball during recess, whatever it was. And then as the last staff is following the last youth up the steps and into the program, the 3 staff connect for a minute and they say, did anybody see any warning signs? Did anybody feel that anybody was triggered? So really, how can you integrate this? And so then if somebody actually had some early warning signs, because actually after school for youth, sometimes it was a time, and they found it was a time of a lot of escalation behaviors. They can take that back and they can work individually and give extra time to that particular person. And that leads to the strategies. So know the warning signs, but also know strategies. And by the way, folks, you know, these calming plans, safety plans, crisis plans are not plans that we do at admission and then leave. They continually change and adapt based on what we learn from people. So these are these are the kind of the miracles, the personal soothing strategies that's going to take that amygdala and move that hippocampus and that cortex to kind of dampen the amygdala, to prevent that extreme arousal. So these are different. And you've been hearing about some of these types of strategies. I know many of you use these strategies yourselves. And I know there was in a psychiatric hospital in Connecticut where they had been using mechanical restraints for years, and they were trying to, and successfully, moving away from using those. But they had one woman, and I happened to actually had a gift of being there and was able to observe through the window that that she wanted the mechanical restraints. She kept saying, I absolutely need to have these. I have to do it. I'll destroy something. And so what they did with the mechanical restraint table is that they put like warm blankets on it, and they gave her, they knew what kind of music that she liked. And so they had that type of music piped into this particular room. And then they would talk gently to her because she was thinking like, okay, you know, I'm going to be okay now. But they actually wouldn't even connect the straps on her. And then they would tell her afterwards, you know, so thinking about how these strategies not only actually can help someone because of the physical, like taking a walk, you know, it really does regulate you, but it also is that image for them. It's that they're thinking about it. So what are strategies? Next slide, please. And so here are some common calming strategies. And thinking about how can we be creative in using these strategies, and how can we make sure that the rules of the unit don't keep us from using these strategies. I know in a program in New Jersey, everybody in the program, they had M3P players, that they got to use their MP3 players. And this one young person actually, when it was time for his laundry, he accidentally put his MP3 player in his big jacket pocket. And so when it came out on the laundry, the MP3 player was ruined because nobody checked his pockets. And so staff were initially saying, okay, he can't have an MP3 player. He can't take care of it. Really? The thing that he needs for soothing? Maybe we need to think about that CEO in Big Springs when he said to the nutritionist, you know, you stay out of this for a while. Our focus is soothing right now. It's comfort. And so if we're going to promote that keeping calm, that self-regulation, think of ways that we can do it. I know that Dr. LaBelle shared an example. She had gotten a call at like, I don't know, like 2 in.the morning about a program saying, is this, they'd gone through this training, and they said, this person, it's 2 in.the morning, they want us to fix them a tuna fish sandwich. And everybody thinks that's ridiculous. Everybody's going to want a tuna fish sandwich if they find out that we gave this client a tuna fish sandwich. But of course, Janice's response was, well, why not? You know, if that's, sometimes we all get up in the middle of the night and need something comforting. So they did that. The person calmed down and served. Nobody else thought they had to have a tuna fish sandwich. And then years later, the leader on this unit who had called actually presented and, you know, about their real program experiences and used that tuna fish sandwich story. So really thinking about what you can do. And I know some of the questions that have come up have been like about really challenges they've had with families. And I know each of you have had challenges with the people we serve. But as one of the panelists kept saying, I think it was Michelle yesterday, just keep trying. just keep trying, do what you can. And then next slide, please. No one strategy works for everyone, find it for this person in this situation. Get those hundreds of tools in your pockets, your staff, and let them know they can use all of those. It is the key to calming. And don't forget to use HALT. How many of you have ever had a toddler that they say was hangry, hungry and upset? So, really having our staff think first, not what's wrong. We always think about what happened, but what's also going on now. Could they be hungry? Could they be angry? Could they be lonely? Could they be tired or thirsty? And so HALT sometimes really supports the people we serve, because it really helps us kind of look at them compassionately, like help us understand this. Oh, hungry, angry, crowded. Thank you very much, Minta. Tired or thirsty. Okay, for introverts, it's hacked. We'll have to put that up there next time. I like that. Okay, next slide, please. And back to what not to do. So it's triggers, warning signs, and strategies, but also strategies that help, but what doesn't help. And as Natasha said, if I'm told a mean way that I can't do something, I begin to lose it. So as Morgan said yesterday, she says, these people that you're serving are coming from houses on fire. They're going to be just ready. So what can we do to find out? And then, of course, and this is one of the goals, folks, maybe this is on your test, I don't know, for your continuing education. Next slide, please. It's a universal rule. Dr. Ross Green, who does trauma systems therapy, that really is based on basically these safety or soothing plans. But he talks about and he worked in programs, was a leader of a program there in Massachusetts for years. And he said everyone he's reviewed started with a staff member enforcing a rule. So we don't ever know, right? So be careful. And I love how, I think it was, who was it who said, let them win? One of the panelists said, let them win, or somebody said, let them win, I think it was Morgan again. So what that we're not going to enforce this rule? Many programs have moved to guidelines rather than rules. So staff know that there is that flexibility. So they're not hard and fast rules, unless it's like things that are brought up, like, a fire alarm or something. So here are a couple of examples of successful plans. And please note that each of you probably has used a successful crisis or safety or soothing plan yourself. You can go through these. You're going to have these PowerPoint slides, so you can use them and go back to them. Look at this 60-year-old developmentally disabled man. He was a fall risk. And so we're talking about, what do? They give him a baby doll to hold, and he wouldn't leave his chair because he wanted to keep this baby safe. So sometimes a soft teddy bear that's been warmed in the microwave. Next slide, please. Here's another example. Very large 40-year-old man with complicated challenges, therefore assaultive. He's not able to verbally process, but he has these bad thoughts. History of reliance upon extensive restraint use. And he wanted to be restrained, kind of similar to we talked about the program in Connecticut. So they made a deal. They would give him this vibrating pillow. He liked the softness, the buzzing sound. He was considered one of the highest users of restraint, considered untreatable, but look what was in his safety and soothing plan. And Tina Champagne is going to be giving you more ideas in terms of these sensory types of strategies. Next slide, please. Here's another one, Shanika, 14-year-old PTSD. And she only really felt safe during pet therapy hours. So what do? You make it happen. She's given the job of meeting pet therapists and walking them in and walking them out. And so they wouldn't allow animals into these hospitals at that point in time. So changing that, going back and changing the absolute bottom pieces of the foundational pieces sometimes of our hospital and programs, and say, gee, we can change that. We can improve that. So next slide. What are the common attributes? It reflects this person's trauma history. We use any available environmental resource and bring more in. It encourages creativity. It incorporates sensory. And we know the needs of that individual, which we keep saying supersede the rules of the institution. So next slide, please. Remember, it's adaptable across the lifespan. Consider strategies that are responsive to the different developmental stages in the population that's specific. People that have cognitive impairment or children, might have to use pictorial descriptions when rather than written descriptions of the triggers, warning signs and strategies. You're going to have to ask family members, not with just people with dementia, but definitely those, but others too. It's a wonderful inquiry, because what we're also doing is subtly teaching that family member that this person is going to most likely go back to the community. And we want them to understand this, triggers, warning signs, and strategies. Have the staff wear their own. Some programs have staff put it on the back of their name tags, that it says their triggers, their warning signs, and their strategies for them. I was in a hospital in Missouri, and walking around with the head of the hospital, the CEO, and one of the patients, when we walked by, said, "Can I look at your name tag?" And he said yes. And she turned it over and she said, "Oh, we have two of the same soothing strategies," because it had that CEO's crisis plan or soothing plan right there. So next slide, please. These are just some examples. You can go back to these. Yes? Oh, I thought I heard somebody say something. So this is what makes you feel better. These are wonderful descriptions. Okay, next slide, please. So essential elements for success. Make sure everybody knows the purpose, what it means. How do you initiate that conversation? Again, compassionate inquiry, where you do it, one-on-one, and then continually revise, use it. Once they're repeating this, every single staff member, you want them to know every single person they served. And in fact, if they go to another unit and they haven't been there before, you want to make sure that first thing they do is look at those soothing, safety, calming crisis plans and begin to get an understanding of what are the triggers, warning signs, and strategies for the different people they serve. Some of them make a copy and just carry it around and remind themselves if they don't know the people served, and use it again so that staff are saying with the client the same way that this person said with the CEO back in Missouri, is that you and I both need music to calm down. That's so interesting. What kind of, it's lowering that divide. Next slide. Discuss it a lot. We were just talking about this. Sometimes people give individual copies to the people served. They email them the copies. They might, put it on the back of check sheets so that when they're going to do their 15-minute or 30-minute checks, they actually can turn it over and see again a reminder of it. So, and tell everybody when you have noticed a successful strategy that hasn't been used with this particular person regularly in the past, talk to the person served, and then get it on their plan. So I think that kind of wraps it up. Next slide. Oh, and these, be mindful, integrated. I think we've talked about these. Have theme groups about it. Next slide. And way back in 2003, Massachusetts did a point-in-time survey in 19 hospitals. 185 youth participated. And in response to the question, what could staff do differently to avoid using restraint seclusion? Look at this. 80 said, talk to me. 75 said, leave me alone. And 54 said, distract me. So you don't know unless you ask. So next slide. And that leads us to, we're going to now focus on the next one, prevention tool. So I hope that you learned or improved something related to, or think about improving something related to using your safety soothing plans. And we're going to now move to this. It's June 29th, and already the light we have less light every day, since solstice. but I'm telling you, Dr. Tina Champagne, can we see you, Tina? Are you there? Can we put her up there? Um, I don't see you yet, Tina, but she is a light that is what I would say, never goes down, never goes out. There she is. Okay. Tina is a recognized expert around the world on sensory modulation approaches. She's written many books. Her light shines bright and always. Listen closely as she imparts wisdom and practical ideas. She kind of has that, she's so smart. She has that double speak sometimes. She's saying two things at once, and some of you are going to catch that. So we wish we could have given her 30 hours because she does do workshops that are probably 30 hours long, but she's going to give you her best in the 30 minutes. Dr. Tina Champagne, over to you.
Thank you, Beth. Now I have to live up to that. So, good morning, everybody, and it's really an honor to be here and to be with you again. I was first introduced to this amazing training team back in 2003 when we were able to do the initial series of the 6 core strategies, and it was a real honor to have this work blended as part of the 6 core strategies. So I'm really grateful. And so what I want to start off with is a quote that I always use with any training that I do on this subject, and it's that the experience of being human is actually embedded in the sensory events of our everyday lives. And that's a quote by Dr. Winnie Dunn, an OT, who's very well known in the field for this work. And I start off with that to help to ground this conversation in that this is about all of us. This isn't just about clients or us. This is about all of us. This is a very humanistic model. It's neuroscientifically based. It's developmental in nature across the lifespan. So this is applicable for all of us, especially in the work we do, and especially when thinking about trauma and trauma-informed care. Every experience we have in our lives, all of it comes in, all that information comes in through our different sensory systems. And so everything essentially that we experience and everything we do has this huge sensory component. And if you don't have difficulty with sensory processing in any sort of a way, then this is automatic for us and you don't necessarily ever think about it. But if you have challenges in this area, you know somebody who does, then you can see how, and you can get to understand how it's important for us to be more aware of this so that we can capitalize on this information and be really strategic in this knowledge and how we utilize this knowledge. And so when we think about sensory integration, what that is how information comes in through our different sensory systems, and that is from outside of ourselves, from within ourselves, and how that information comes together, again, neurophysiologically, emotionally, and how we make sense of that information as human beings. And that helps to support our ability to engage in relationships and to behave appropriately in different situations, to be able to self-regulate. And so, this helps us to set the stage for why this is so important. Sensory integration actually includes 3 major areas. So sensory discrimination is one of those areas. It's how we distinguish between different kinds of sensory stimuli. And this happens in every single one of the sensory systems. It includes motor performance, so things like muscle tone, balance, body awareness, body coordination, our body map. And it also includes sensory modulation. And most people understand this as the regulatory component of sensory integration. And this can look like having hypersensitivities to different kinds of stimuli, hyposensitivities, which is the opposite of being hypersensitive. So somebody can be sensitive to touch, different kinds of tactile input, or to sound, to taste, to smells, as an example, or it can be the complete opposite, or some combination. And when people have these kinds of challenges in any of these 3 areas, it can be mild, moderate, or severe. And it's also impacted, that level of intensity is impacted by what we're going through. And especially if we've had a trauma history or we have some other sort of mental health challenge on top of that, sometimes these things are interconnected and interrelated. And so you might see someone who seeks different kinds of input, sensory input, and you're like, what is going on? I wonder, why that person, so desperately wants to pace on the unit, or, seeks out deep pressure, such as with use of weighted blankets, or is constantly asking for a hug, or even think about the sensory input that someone receives when engaged in a restraint, for example. And so we really, really want to look at not only these kinds of behaviors, but what's behind the behaviors, or when someone's avoiding different kinds of sensory input. We had a young man where I work at the moment, and we have many different programs, but he was participating in our school, our special education school, and also in our residential programs. And he is someone who had really, really severe tactile hypersensitivity, sound sensitivities, extreme oral motor sensitivities, and difficulty with coordinating his body. And until we had a thorough OT evaluation, people weren't aware of any of that. It just looked like constant explosive behaviors. So you can imagine how that impacted his ability to go to school, let alone remain in school and learn in school. And then also things like ADLs, eating, taking a shower, having to get dressed in clothes that really bothered him when he didn't have the ability to explain what was going on. And honestly, he thought people knew what was going on with him, because he thought everybody had the same feelings and perceptions as he did. And so he thought that people were actually assaulting him. He was able to describe this to us really eloquently as he got older and was able to reflect back after doing a lot of work with us. So we really want to be able to learn and understand more about this, because it'll better help us to understand the behaviors we see, and then therefore how we respond therapeutically. And I also just want to take a moment to state, we all have our own patterns. And so, I was once working with an OT in an acute inpatient hospital for adults, and we were working on starting to establish a sensory room to then be able to get staff input. And she was somebody who had a lot of hypersensitivities, and I tend to be the opposite. So I'm more of a seeker. I like to touch things, feel things, try things, engage. And she was somebody who was like, it's too much. So, even within us, within your coworkers, within your intimate relationships, we all have our own different sensory patterns and our own sensory biases. So another thing that we want to keep in mind, there's a assessment tool called the sensory profile. It's available in different age ranges, but I always say that the adult sensory profile should be used by dating services, because again, people are often unaware of this and they don't understand why people behave the way that they do sometimes. And so again, this is one piece of that, but something that I think is really important as we move forward. So again, these patterns impact our relationships, they impact behaviors, they impact emotions, and the ability to engage in important life activities and relationships optimally. These challenges definitely worsen when we're distressed or when we have anxiety. And they can often cause anxiety, so that's something to keep in mind. And trauma definitely impacts our sensory processing. It tends to increase hypersensitivities to things like touch and sound and others. And then it also can impact our muscle tone and our coordination. It can also be part of when we see hypervigilant states. It plays a role in dissociation. And so again, the more we study trauma and how it impacts the body, we're learning more and more about how it also impacts sensory processing. And so what we're going to talk about in the next several slides is looking at something that we call in OT a sensory diet, and that is a menu of different options that you can utilize in a strategic way as part of your routine. We can think about that individually for an individual client, or we can think about it for the program and think about our routines for the program. And then also looking at our therapeutic environments. And so again, you can use this information on a lot of different scales. So if you can go to the next slide. The different sensory systems are listed here. Most of us know about the 5 basic senses. But usually people, if they aren't familiar with this information, don't know so much about proprioception and vestibular input. And these two particular sensory systems are extremely important. They're often called the hidden senses. Proprioception is the input you get in through your muscles and joints and your tendons. So imagine yourself riding a bicycle and pumping down into the pedals really hard to your feet, and imagine the kind of pressure sensation that you get through your muscles and joints. Or when you exercise, or when you vacuum, or when you rake your yard. That's all examples of proprioceptive input. And that helps us to feel more grounded in our bodies physically, and it helps us to be more organized when we get that kind of input. And then also vestibular input, you can think of that as your own internal GPS, your own spatial orientation, your own spatial system. And so we have receptors in our different sensory systems, and these very specialized receptors help to pick up on all this kind of input. And we could take a whole day just on this, but please know that these systems all work together. And as we stated before, you can have sensory challenges in any of these different systems. And so that's why there's the complexity of this work, where again, OTs can help you, and some psychologists are also trained in these areas, can help you to assess these areas, and that can be value added with your treatment planning. There is one other sensory system that's been added to this big 7, and that's called interoception. And interoception is basically our ability to know how we're feeling inside. So am I feeling hungry? Am I feeling tired? Am I coming down with something? And to what degree? So oftentimes our clients really struggle with their ability to be really self-aware, let alone put language to that and to explain how they're doing at any given time. Next slide. So sensory modulation and integration activities can be helpful with those who have these other symptoms as well, or different diagnoses. Next slide. And so we want to think about things in terms of what might be add to what we can offer to people when we need things like helping them to expand on their grounding strategies, for example. And so thinking about the different sensory systems as well, and knowing that we have to have an option or a range of things because everybody is so different. There are no cookbooks. So, you know, here's some examples, things like weighted vest, weighted blanket, wrapping tightly in a blanket or a sheet, arm or hand massages, push-ups, any kind of exercise is going to be beneficial. Aerobic exercise, we know there's a lot of research coming out on that and how beneficial that is. Even things like chewing, you can chew crunchy carrots, you can chew gum, or sucking on things like hot or sour candies. These are all ways to get different kinds of sensory input and capitalize on this sensory-based knowledge. Next slide, please. Calming or self-soothing strategies. Think really hard about what works for you, you know, when you're feeling really stressed. So not only what works for you, but when and how do you use these different things? So, you know, maybe what works for you in the morning may or may not work for you later in the day, and may not always be about calming. Sometimes we want to do things that are uplifting too, or some combination. So things like a shower, a bath, wrapping in a heavy quilt, different kinds of herbal teas, rocking in rocking chairs, beanbag tapping, yoga, different sorts of drumming techniques, meditation. These are all just examples of things that might be useful in your different types of settings. Next slide, please. Simple sensory enhancements to the environment. So wanting to have attractive features, think about the color of paint that's in your different setting, and the use of things like wall decals or wall murals, artwork, having plants or different types of window treatments, music, comfortable seating options, using things like dimmer switches when we can. And so here's just a very simple example of an adult inpatient unit that served older persons and also adults. And they wanted to add a wall mural. And so what we did was I actually worked on this unit at the time. What we did was we had some wall mural books that we put in the staff office, and people actually voted on which one they wanted. We talk about our biases. Boy, was that a exercise in learning about what each other's likes and dislikes were. And this would not have been my first choice for the wall mural that was picked, but this is the one that won. And I will tell you that I worked at this setting for approximately 8 years. And this we did early in my employment there. And 8 years later, this was probably the only wall on the entire unit that did not get marked up, ruined, spit upon, what have you. And I really believe it's because, we got people's input as to which mural that they wanted to see. And so it's very important to get staff input as much as possible. And of course, all of these things take time, and they take funding, and they take effort, as you've heard over the last several days. But it's oftentimes extremely important and very much worth that effort. So again, sensory rooms there's many different types, and what we're talking about is largely utilization for modulation, regulating types of purposes. And so again, use of paints and different types of furnishings that promote relaxation and or stimulation. We want a room that provides opportunities and choices. And also, there's a place for people to try different things and to be able to build those different skills that they're working on. Next slide. Next slide, please. And so within sensory rooms, people often ask me, well, what do you put in them? And it really depends on the type of setting that you are, the safety variables involved, the age ranges of the people served. But here's just some general examples of common things that might be found in sensory rooms. So different sorts of projectors or fiber optic lamps, glider rockers, regular rocking chairs, padded mats, weighted items such as blankets or stuffed animals, different music options, therapy balls, aromatherapy. Of course, some of these things we need to be careful of. We'll talk about that later and make sure there's policies and procedures around fish tanks, Tupperware containers with rice are often just sand, or you can put different objects in there for people to find. These are just some very simple, common examples. Next slide. So again, guidelines for use. Depending on where you're working, you may need to think about, and you definitely want to find out, if you don't already know, what are some other restrictions? So do you have a setting where you need to have fire resistant items, latex-free items, getting things that are generally safe and easily washable, easily sanitized is really, really important in most of the settings that we all work in. We might want to have a locked cabinet or locked cart of some kind to lock away items that need more supervision. We're going to want to have policies and procedures for the maintenance of the room and the equipment. Staff training. At times when we first develop sensory spaces, we may want to literally schedule access because it may not be part of the routine yet. And so to help people to either have small groups in these spaces if it's appropriate, or again, schedule different types of meetings and utilization so that people have times where it's open and things are accessible. And then also, some of these things will be part of their, hopefully having things that are part of the safety tool that Beth was just describing earlier. Next slide. So the next few slides are examples of some of the different types of sensory modulation related rooms that have been created, and of all different kinds and all different sorts of settings. So this is an example of a Zen room. You see the soft colors, neutral tones, and clearly the goal of this space is more of a Zen calming type of relaxation space. Next slide, please. This is an example of a room from Cooley Dickinson Hospital, quite some time ago now, but we had very little space on the unit, and the wallpaper was horrible. And so we did our best to get items that were on the unit, bring them into this space. Back when sponge painting was popular, you can see we sponge painted the walls. The colors were chosen by a vote of staff, and we basically had a few different musical items of musical equipment. We had a lockable cabinet in there, which you can't see. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a study that we did, a QI study that we did on using this space a little bit later. But this was a sensory modulation space in an adult and older person acute inpatient unit. Next slide. And this is a sensory room from Western State Hospital. You can see the wall mural they chose and a big fluffy bean bag with soft comforters and pillows. Next slide. Staff relaxation room, so we can also work with our staff to help to create spaces, or it can even be any staff lounge that's available or staff space where they can also help to make that more sensory friendly. Next slide. And whether you may not have space for a room, you might want to then develop what we call a sensory cart. Or it can be in addition to having a sensory room. And these carts, again, can be made for all different purposes. I know of a unit where the nurses on an inpatient unit, an adult unit, that they helped to create what they called a sleep cart, and they had all different options and things that were deemed safe to bring onto the unit that they created to help people to be able to wind down on the evening shift. So you can really get creative and have fun with these different ideas. Next slide. And here's an example of that with Gail Bluebird. She is a nurse, and so she capitalized on helping to bring comfort theory, which comes from the profession of nursing, to this idea of the sensory room, and created what she calls comfort room. And that's very similar. It's a room that provides sanctuary from stress and can be a place for persons to experience feelings with acceptable boundaries. It's considered a prevention tool, and hoping that it will help to decrease the use of seclusion and restraint. And in our experience, that is often what we see. Next slide. And another from Gail Bluebird. The comfort room is set up to be physically comfortable, pleasing to the eye. It can include things like rocker chairs, recliner chairs, soft colors, murals, colorful curtains, things of that nature. Next slide. So again, this idea of a sensory room, it's really an umbrella term for all different kinds of sensory spaces, whether it's snoozling rooms, if you work with people with developmental disabilities, with dementia, they oftentimes, you've probably heard of snoozling rooms. These spaces have more high-tech types of equipment, really, really durable and washable types of equipment. And they often are quite stimulating, but they can be modulated so that they're more or less so. A sensory integration space is something that's used more by occupational therapists to target all those different areas of sensory integration we talked about earlier. Multi-sensory rooms, sensory gardens, comfort rooms, the soothing rooms. People get really creative with what they call the spaces, such as peace rooms, chillville, Zen spaces, the sanctuary, the retreat. So again, you want to be really playful with this. Whenever possible, get people's input, including your client population, of course. And that's when you're going to see more utilization. Next slide. And so the next few slides are examples of some different types of studies that have been done. And this is one that I conducted with a colleague, Ed Thayer, and it was using that sensory room that I pointed out where we did the sponge painting and whatnot. And what we did is we used a Likert scale, and we had clients rate where they were at before they went in the room. We had them just explore, utilize what they wanted to, try the things that they wanted to. And as they were leaving, we had them identify on that Likert scale where they were at that moment. We gathered from them the things that they utilized in the space, and then we also collected other ideas of things that they'd like to see in the space. So it was a multi-purpose sort of QI study. And 46 people with different diagnosis and cognitive abilities participated, and there was a total of 96 sessions. Next slide. The results of this, 89% reported a positive change. One person had a negative change, and 10% reported no change. And it's important to note that when I started at this particular setting, they were 3 standard deviations above the state mean for the use of seclusion and restraint. And after a 2-year period, and all that really changed at the time was increasing the utilization of these types of approaches, including the sensory room. And we saw a 75% reduction in seclusion and restraint over that period of time. So it was a 3 standard deviation change from where they had been. Next slide. Next, please. So how are approaches being integrated? They're being incorporated into daily activities. You can, of course, add them into the treatment plan. We spoke about earlier, Beth spoke about the safety plans. So it's important to make sure that things that are identified as safety plans are also things that you would have available for people where it is that you are working. Looking at the routines where you work, can you offer groups? Are there different types of times of day where you can schedule things in that are sensory related, groups and or individual sessions? Make sure that resources are available. You often see people wanting to utilize these strategies in place of or before they might ask for a PRN. They can help when people are detoxing, can integrate these strategies into DBT if that's an example of a framework that you use, or any of the others, even things like the ARC model and other therapeutic interventions are now starting to integrate sensory-based approaches. We can use these to self-soothe older individuals and help them even when they're sundowning. So there's lots of different ways to think about this work and to integrate it over time. Next slide. And so again, think about different relaxation strategies and how to help sensorize them. Visualization, deep breathing. These are things that we often use, but also adding things like self-massage, sand therapy, art therapy, using different sorts of tastes and like frozen oranges or different murals, how to perhaps add dimmer switches when possible to help to change the lighting in an environment, the use of different sorts of therapy balls or vibration. Clinical aromatherapy is one area, and also weighted modalities and even pet therapy, where you're going to want to make sure that you have policies and procedures for these things because, again, they're modalities. And so we want to be practicing safely. Different types of interventions that you can use can also be strategic in thinking about, so what are the symptoms the person is experiencing and what can be helpful to them in that way. So for example, with PTSD, using ice, other sensory related grounding techniques, relaxation exercises, weighted modalities. When someone's experiencing anxiety, what kinds of things can we help and can we help them to try, or can we offer? Next slide. If someone has cognitive limitations, or maybe they have dementia, or maybe they're very young, again, thinking about, do we need to help to chill down the environment? So destimulation. Or, you know, we also don't want people to be sensory deprived, because then we're going to see different sorts of behavioral outbursts or different behavioral patterns. So what things can be utilized from that perspective? Maybe blanket warmers on some units to help people, especially places that are air conditioned, for example. Next slide. And here is an example of a study that happened in Massachusetts with the DMH, 64% of adult units. And after utilization of sensory interventions in their units, they had a 36% decrease in restraint use, 15% decrease in property damage, 31% decrease in self-destructive behavior, 21% decrease in physical assault. Next slide. Other benefits could be, you know, look at how we can really expand on the range of options for consumers, not only for when they're in crisis, but also prevention related during their daily activities. We can increase alternatives to staff, which is extremely important. It's, you know, one thing to say we need to decrease the use of seclusion and restraint, but okay, so then what are we going to use? These strategies help to decrease agitation for our different consumer populations. We can use clear, measurable ways to look at whether clients' levels of distress are being decreased. This helps us to significantly improve the quality of care we provide, and it really expands on our different sorts of therapeutic activities. So some simple things to think about implementing into your setting. You can have a sensory fair, and that could be where you set up some of these different options and have staff go through and try them, or have your clients go through and try them, or all of the above. And so they can really see, what is this all about? It can often seem daunting to add different types of strategies if people don't have a real sense of, so, what is this for and how does this work? Look for different spaces that you might have where you work that may be neglected or may need to be updated. And those are great times to think about this and maybe have a contest with your staff to vote on what they would like to see. Grow your own scented herbs or have a window garden, or maybe sites that use their rooftops can think about expanding out that way. Next slide. And so really what we're after here is to offer this greater range of options. And we want to try to avoid and resolve different crises that could lead to seclusion and restraint. We really, really hope this helps you to think about ways to expand your toolbox of therapeutic options. Some fun things to do is to sit with your team and brainstorm. Think about the different sensory systems, take one at a time and brainstorm, well, what are some different things that we could bring into the unit or to your setting that are related to this sensory system that could be used in different ways, whether it's grounding or soothing or uplifting or what have you. And that's one way to build upon ideas. Ask your clients when you're doing individual or group sessions, as you're trialing these different things, ask them, what else would you like to see here that we could offer? Expanding that toolbox, helping to, at least one person spoke about, creating these admission kits. Well, how about helping people to make their own sensory kit and making it really individualized in that way? This really helps to promote self-awareness of ourselves and also of and with our different client populations. It really helps people to engage in self-care, and it helps to promote self-regulation. So think about ways maybe if self-care ADLs are an issue, what kinds of things could be added or implemented to help people to be able to more comfortably engage in self-care? What are the barriers around their ability to engage in different self-care activities? And of course, this will help to also strengthen your therapeutic relationship. Your clients will be able to recognize when somebody really gets where they're coming from. And it'll help you to be able to connect with them and to offer them different options. Next slide. And this one, I know I struggle with this, but practice yourself what you preach. The only way to get really, really skilled at this sort of an approach is to know yourself. And the more you understand how this relates to yourself, the better you're going to be able to come up with ideas and ways to help your different client populations and your settings to engage in this work. Again, there are no cookbooks. Everybody's different. What works for me may or may not work for you. And so again, it's something that it's trial and error. This takes time. Don't be frustrated if you feel like you've done this work and you've had a lot of staff turnover and you feel like you're starting back at square one again. That's happened to all of us, especially with the advent of COVID. And so again, it's just doing your best to bring this into your settings one day at a time. Thank you. Here's places where you can obtain sensory items and different resources.
Thank you so much, Tina. Outstanding as usual. It's always so good to hear from you as the international expert on this work. And folks, I just want to mention something, but back in the 2000s when we were putting together the curriculum, we didn't know anything about sensory modulation. So this had a huge impact in what we did and how we developed the 6 core strategies. And it's just been a wonderful learning experience along the years. So Dr. Champagne is really to be thanked and honored for her work, starting way back then. And she's just done so much over the years, and it's just always great to see you.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me today.
Yeah, Tina, as people are sharing like great ideas that you bring, and one person shared that they've seen the effectiveness of sensory items, fidgets, therapy, soft lighting, you're seeing it crushed on, so some people, as you said, are doing it. And I always learn from you. I've only heard you like probably 43 times present, and each time I'm thinking, yes, that, or share that, or that's a good idea.
I almost gave the example of a seeking pattern, and I'm going to do it now and embarrass you, of some of our earlier conferences on this subject, where we'd have Beth, she would be dancing on the tables, getting people up and going. And so again, very fond memories.
Yes, well, we wanted to do kind of a virtual modeling, and get music going and pieces, but anyway, it's difficult to arrange. So any questions, anybody, any comments about either anything to do with sensory? Because how often do you have Tina Champagne there to talk to? Really, I can't tell you how many times I've called her, or texted her, or emailed her. So you have her here if you have any questions, even about an individual who you're serving. And also, if you have any questions about improving or implementing, if you haven't already, the use of safety or calming plans, soothing plans, we're open. It's kind of like that radio show. Okay, folks, ready for questions.
There's a comment from Bahati. Thank you. I love the presentation, and especially the idea of relaxation rooms.
Yes, this is really applicable across everywhere we work. I've seen this work applied in shelters, in forensic settings, where you often have the highest level of safety concerns. So where there's a will, there's a way. And, also just being persistent. No matter where I work personally, this takes time. And as I said, COVID has really knocked us back a peg, a lot of us. And so just sticking with it and just keeping it, in the forefront of what we do and how we practice, really, really important.
Yep.
Did you notice, Tina, how Minta shared that the halt for introverts is hacked? I don't know if you were on, and that to ask if they're hungry, angry, is it too crowded? So when I think about sensory, I thought that, wow, that's a very interesting piece. Some people need their space. And so it gets right into some of the things that you're sharing.
Halt also has a lot to do with interoception, this thought of hungry, am I tired? Am I thirsty? Am I not feeling well? Am I coming down with something? And just the fact that so much of the trauma field has really embraced this work, and on an increasing basis. We have a lot more work to do in our understanding, but certainly it's helped to validate how important and critical this piece is. So.
Right. Jeff is sharing sensory diets are very important for our nonverbal clients, folks with ASD. So people don't see that. So good comments, folks. Smart people out there doing good work. So we not only need to have Tina everywhere, but all of you seem to have such experience. It's just make sure you're going around and sharing your wisdom with all of your colleagues especially in your own programs. We need to, as Tina just said, after COVID rebuilding, get everybody excited about this stuff, get them knowledgeable about it. Oh, Kelly has her hand up, Dana. Do your magic.
Hi, Tina. I'm an occupational therapist. I actually work over at Fuller Hospital, and we have a sensory room on our unit. And I feel like lately I've been running into an issue of I feel like it's too cluttered, so they don't necessarily like grab items that maybe like they might not see them, things like that. But have you ever run into it where maybe it's too cluttered and you kind of rotate out items, or you feel like you don't have enough items that are actually beneficial and kind of going about getting new ones? Because I know like with the hospital, sometimes the budgets are hard, and that's kind of one of my problems too.
So yes, yes, and yes. There's often times where we get so good at this that we have a lot of stuff. And, just like in our own homes, that comes a time where we have to either send things out or find ways to organize things like carts or cabinets and have things labeled. And then there's the opposite time when, we're developing spaces or carts or what have you. And we realize, oh, we need some of these other items. And so this is where the 6 core strategies are so critical, because it's also that whole leadership piece, working with your leadership around, what are the goals? And when we have these plans that include, and we really look at our strategic plans that are related to and have all these components of the 6 core strategies, it helps to support why this is so important. And then leadership can also look at their budgeting and do their best to, provide the resources we need. But it is a huge undertaking, because some of these different modalities also need to have policies and procedures, because we want to use things safely. We need to train staff. So yeah, as this work evolves, even within the same setting, for years and years, you can see the ebbs and the flows. And like anything else, it needs our attention over time.
Thank you. Sounds like I have some work ahead of me, but I'm ready to do it.
That's
Kelly,
awesome.
Kelly, the other piece, given again that I'm 105 and have been in every program in the world, but no, is that, even with the sensory rooms, and maybe you already do this, you really want to try to do those individual sensory baskets or boxes or anything, so that you can start giving people things that they can, that really work for them. And then they can actually give it to their family members and replenish those, so that works. So we have a question for you, Tina. This person, Angela, ooh, my favorite person, works at Arbor. She's currently revamping their sensory rooms as part of their restraint reduction. They're having difficulty in finding someone to paint their murals. And some of their sensory rooms have them, but not. Do you have any contacts for that? No, had low luck with the schools.
My go-to in the past has been reaching out to schools that train people in art therapy or in the arts. So if you're struggling there, that's a tough one. And wall murals, wall decals, and whatnot. I always just surf the web these days, and depending on what I'm looking for, just get as specific as you can in the search area.
Another option is what I've done is often we have clients that are extremely skilled with art. Recovery International, all of their facilities have large wall murals in them that are chosen by the clients, and then there's usually consumers that actually will come in and do that work, not for free, but I found some really talented artists in our population of people that have come in for services. So that's another option, to reach out to your local peer support groups and see who's there that is talented in that way.
Yeah, Brenna has a good idea too. Area high schools, key clubs, National Art Honor Societies.
Mm-hmm.
And then can you read what Kristen wrote?
Thank you.
Everybody, well, I can read. I've noticed my own feelings associated with nice and calming spaces in the building, both for the staff and the clients and the families. When I'm in a calming space, I'm definitely in a better space to do my work. The same with those dysregulated children. The same can be said for them. Quiet space, thoughtful lighting. Good observations. Good noticing that. That's great. Oh, good for you. Look at Dana, our wonderful Dana. Personal anecdote from your tech support. I'm hard of hearing. If anything, that has me more keenly aware of sounds in the physical space around me. Thank you, Dana.
People often think about relaxation, and one of the things that sensory modulation helps to bring is the fact that it's not always about de-escalation necessarily in the way of calming.
Right.
Sometimes, if someone's really depressed, for example, and they need help with things to get up and get going, it's not necessarily going to be, on a Mach 10, but again, thinking of the variety of things, calming and uplifting, and the combination of the two.
Yeah, I call it alerting.
Yeah.
And I know that when I have to go on long car drives, for instance, and you know how you get tired, and fireballs work really well for me.
Okay, well, and lots of nice comments, interesting, ideas. And Tina, as usual, you got it rolling. You got people, more excited to continue to do this work. And feel free, folks, to if things come up, this is our last day of this training, but if things come up, you can, you have Dana's email. You can always, he'll forward any questions that come up to Kevin and myself. So, and we can get it to Tina if you want. So just really great work, Tina. And I know that you have a million examples, and just from your own program, because she's also the CEO of Cushions. Did I say it right?
Hutchins Programs for Children and Families.
Yeah, I told you I mispronounced my ex-husband's names too. I'm bad at pronunciation. So, but anyway, why don't we do an early break? If that's okay, we'll do an early break and we'll start. Kevin, what if we start at 5 of? Would that work? Okay, so we're going to start at 5 of, everybody. Remember, you got to move and groove when you're up, when you get on your break. And thank you again, Tina. What a blessing, you who go around the world and people talk to you. We go to Australia and we hear people saying, oh, the wonderful Tina Champagne came here and did this and did that. And, and that you're giving to these staff who, I have to say, Kevin and I adore this audience now, and we don't know them, but we adore them. We're so happy that the 6th course started with them. So, okay, everybody, please be back by 5 of, and we'll start again. Thank you, Tina. Go, Kevin.
Thanks, Dana. So we are now going to go through the last 6th course strategy, which is called rigorous debriefing. And then I'm going to go ahead and continue directly into the development of a strategic reduction plan, with just some kind of tips and hints on how to do that. So what we're going to do in terms of debriefing is we're going to look at the 3 core debriefing activities, understand the processes involved in those activities, and understand on how we use debriefing to learn from what happened so that we can inform the future. Next slide. So the definition of debriefing, it's a stepwise tool designed to examine what just occurred from everybody's perspective. Do that in a place that feels safe for staff to discuss what happened, to give us an opportunity to collect real-time data on what occurred so that we're not waiting till the next day where people's memories start getting not as accurate, and to have a better outcome next time. It's important for you guys to know, in a way, that debriefing started out in the military because it was a way for military leaders to keep on top of what was going on in very rapidly changing environments, and to keep informed so they could keep extremely flexible in their plans. Debriefing after that has been recognized and adopted in just about every industry in the world. And it has been pointed out that debriefing, or rigorous root cause analysis, is probably the single most important reason that we have not had a federal aviation disaster over the last couple decades, because the FAA is unbelievably skilled in doing debriefing. So debriefing should answer these questions. What happened? Why did it happen? What was the whole story of what happened? And when I say the whole story, what I'm talking about is when you frequently go back and look at medical records of events that occurred, even now, today, you will find things that documentation that will say something like, Beth got very upset and struck out at staff and was restrained. Well, that doesn't tell me the story of anything. That's just kind of a nothing statement, because I don't know what happened. I don't know the when, why, where, how of it. And so I can't do anything with that information. That's like the tip of the iceberg. So we really want to use debriefing to find out the story of what happened. What did we learn, and what do we want to change? Next slide. So in debriefing, the first goal after an event of seclusion or restraint is to repair any harm done. So that could be harm to staff, to the client who was actually restrained or secluded, and all the other people standing around watching. So the way we do that is, first of all, we have an immediate huddle so the staff can discuss the event, what could have been done differently, and it gives supervisors a chance to kind of check out the staff in the room, see if anybody seems to be particularly quiet or revved up. Takes an opportunity to help people start to calm down, and what we call going back to pre-crisis, the pre-crisis milieu. As a manager, if you think staff are not comfortable talking in a group, then you have the responsibility to meet with those staff individually. And also, even though you often can't talk about the actual clinical perspective of what happened, you could certainly walk around, and staff should be assigned to walk around and check in with all the other clients and just say, are you okay? I'm sorry you had to see that. Sometimes in an attempt to keep people safe, we have to use those kinds of strategies, and do you want to talk about it? Next slide. The second debriefing goal is to prevent the future use of seclusion and restraint by documenting the story of what happened. So again, that can be the future use on that particular person, or it can inform policy so that the policy can change. For instance, when we've seen patterns on food access, or TV access, or phone access, or visiting hours, sometimes these events occur and bring up necessary policy changes that can affect a much larger number of clients than just the one person that was involved in that restraint event. So the way we do that is we want to have the staff and the individual help us identify what led to the incident and what could have been done differently. We want to figure out if we acted as staff, we acted quick enough, and we considered all the alternatives or least restrictive methods, or did we have time to do that, or did the event escalate so fast we didn't? And we also want to make sure that our staff training has allowed staff to be competent in these situations, and that they understand that when these things happen, they have the power pretty much to do anything to avoid this event. And so again, not just having staff think they're supposed to be enforcing rules, but staff actually being able to, in the moment, make decisions that would keep someone from getting harmed. Next slide. The third goal is to address hospital policy problems and make appropriate changes. What I was kind of just talking about. And this is where it's really helpful to have our direct care staff feel comfortable enough to be able to come up to supervisors and say, you know what, I think this rule on such and thus, we really need to talk about it. We really maybe need to change it, because I've noticed in the last 3 months, we've had 3 or 4 seclusion and restraint events around the enforcement of this rule. Next slide. So the first challenge that we saw when we started to look at debriefing and the development of the 6 core strategies was that we really saw that we needed to understand the process of seclusion and restraint. What actually happened during an event? And I remember when we were interviewing the clients and the staff about what it felt like to restrain or seclude, or what it felt like to be in seclusion or restraint. A lot of people had this belief that these things just happened, like they just exploded. There wasn't a lead up. It happened very quickly. A lot of times staff would say, you know, the person just got violent and they weren't even provoked and we didn't even know they were upset. So when we started breaking down the behaviors that led to the use of seclusion and restraint and the environments in which those occurred, we really saw a very different story. And so what we did was we kind of walked through the discrete steps that might lead to the use of seclusion and restraint. And obviously people don't follow these steps exactly all the time, but it's a very helpful way when you're starting to debrief to be able to go through the event in this way. So next slide. So step one, as we're starting to look at what just happened, had we created a treatment environment where conflict was minimized? And when I say that, you know, ask yourself the question, how are new admissions greeted? Who does the admission assessment? Are they our best staff that are excellent in engagement? Or are they staff that really are bored and don't want to do the admission assessment and barely even look up from their computer while they're asking a lot of very personal questions? Do we offer people in the admission suite drinks, food, a blanket, a shower? Do we just send them to the unit and told them to like point and say, there's your room? Or did we orient them to the unit, tell them where they could get help, where they could use a phone, where they could get water, where the bathrooms were, their roommate was going to be? I mean, a lot of times we're doing things that are very odd. You know, as adults, if I was admitted to a unit and I walked on the unit, you know, here I am, have a house, you know, I haven't had a roommate since I was in college. And all of a sudden I'm supposed to spend the night with some strange person I never even met in my whole life. That can be extremely uncomfortable. So, you know, how are we managing that? Step two, could the trigger for conflict, which could be personal, the disease process, environmental, have been prevented or not? Did we look at risk factors on admission? Did we ask about worries about, you know, family members or bills or pets while the person is usually involuntarily committed? What was the person disorganized and maybe not able to remember things and what you were trying to tell them? Did they seem scared or paranoid? Did you take that into consideration when you chose their room? Did you make sure they were comfortable? Did you reassure them? Next slide. Did the staff notice and respond early to the event unfolding? Now, obviously, sometimes it does happen very quickly, but more often than not, if you know the clients that you're caring for and they're in your unit and you've checked in with them when you came on shift, you're going to be able to note a change in affect or behavior much more quickly. And if you do notice something happening, did you get up and go out in the milieu, or did you just sit in the nursing station and see what else happened? Did anybody respond quickly? Step four, did you choose an effective intervention? Had you done a safety plan? Do you know the client? Do you know what works with that client? Would have taken them on a walk been better out in the courtyard? Would have gone down to their room and had a one-to-one? Would that have been an alternative that might have worked better? Maybe giving the person what they were asking for, unless it was an imminent safety risk, would have helped avoid the use of seclusion and restraint. If that intervention or strategy was unsuccessful, did you have time to choose another one? And what was it? Next slide. Did staff order seclusion and restraint only in response to imminent danger or not? Does staff even know what imminent danger means? Does everybody have the same definition? Often people respond very differently to these kind of very high stress events, and all of us have different stress tolerances. And in general, most of the time, younger staff have a much lower threshold on anxiety, so they tend to act quicker to call for help and possibly a code and possibly for seclusion and restraint than staff that have been around for ages and seen a lot of these events and have a lot of comfort in their own de-escalation competencies. So again, that isn't blaming, it's just looking at the facts. Did we apply seclusion or restraint safely? Did we do it per hospital or facility policy? Was the individual monitored appropriately, preferably face to face and not through a little black and white camera? Did we get the person out of seclusion or restraint as soon as possible? I just talked to someone yesterday who's a reporter actually, who's doing a story, and the facility that they're looking at routinely leaves adults in seclusion for 12 hours. That's completely unnecessary. That is ridiculous, in fact. And in Pennsylvania, their rule is 3 minutes. So look at the difference in use of this still way overused strategy, seclusion and restraint. Did post-event debriefing occur? Did learning occur? Was it integrated into that person's treatment plan? And did it, if it could, did it inform the hospital policies and procedures? Next slide. So there's 3 categories of debriefing. The first is we call the post-acute event. And that includes interview with the consumer if possible, but sometimes it's too soon. The second is formal debriefing the next working day. And then somewhere in between the event and the formal debriefing, the client should be debriefed. Next slide. Who should be present at the post-acute event? Everybody that was just involved, that was on the unit and watched what happened. A supervisor should come in. Remember when we talked about witnessing? A supervisor on site, regardless of where they are in the hospital, should immediately respond, or a resident manager, if you're in a residential program, whoever is the high-level staff person who's there on weekends, holidays, and after hours, they should immediately respond as an individual that can help reorganize, settle down the unit, and gather the information. And again, gathering that information very quickly. What some facilities have moved to is the minute an event occurs, staff who were on the unit are asked to write down on a piece of informal paper what they saw and what they heard and what they know about what just happened. And those pieces of paper are then turned into that supervisor. And that way you avoid group think, because once you get involved in group think, you lose a lot of information. Next slide. You want to focus on hierarchy of needs. So the physical and emotional needs of clients and staff, make sure everybody's okay, return to pre-crisis milieu, and then communicate with administration and to the unit staff through shift report as the day goes forward, so everybody knows what happens. To be successful, these debriefings need to be followed up on by hospital and facility leadership. This post-acute event debriefing is critically important because what you're acting, your role there as a direct care staff person is either as a journalist or a detective. And you want to get the full story before people start to forget. The formal debriefing happens within 24 to 48 hours. It's led by a senior manager. It often includes the treatment team. And this is where you walk through what happened, the story, the full story of what happened. One staff person cannot tell the full story unless you've got a process in place where you've gathered this information from all the staff right after the event. And again, you want to avoid going down this group think of, oh, it just happened and the person just got escalated and reached the threshold of imminent danger. We had to restrain them. That is not adequate to document as to what the story was. There is almost always a trigger that happened that person responded to. Sometimes it began days before, often the day before or that morning, a couple hours before. And that's where we need to become detectives. Next slide. Consumer debriefing. Okay, so what I've always done is try and go in to see the person right after the event to make sure they're doing okay, to check in, to see if they want to talk. debriefing is more than kind of setting the record straight. It's also about sharing responsibility. This is also a very important time for staff to be comfortable to go in and say, I'm really sorry this happened. If we want the people we serve to learn how to manage intense emotions, we need to role model that. We need to disclose when we make mistakes. And again, the use of apology is a great way to open up this conversation. Erin Lazaire, who's actually from Massachusetts, wrote a book on apology, and it's an excellent book. I believe it's still available. It's a little paperback book. It's a really good thing to read. Most important is the involvement of hospital and facility leaders who hear about this particular event or events very quickly within the next day at the morning meeting, for instance. It is not adequate for leaders to just sit in a quality improvement meeting every quarter and see a bunch of data on seclusion and restraint. It's too dehumanized and it doesn't tell you anything. Next slide. Example of consumer questions that would be something that a staff member would ask the person who was restrained. How did we fail to understand what you needed? What upset you the most? What did we do that was helpful? What did we do that got in the way? And what can we do better next time? And again, sometimes emotions are extremely high. And so right after the event is not the time to debrief. You have to use your judgment. And sometimes, again, decontaminating the experience by going in and saying, I'm really sorry this happened, can be extraordinarily helpful in resetting everything so that you can actually then ask those questions. Some facilities, and I think this was led and modeled by in Massachusetts in the state hospital system, hire peer support specialists to be peer debriefers, to conduct client debriefings after incidents of restraint or seclusion for a lot of really good reasons. One is that they're already well known to the patient population. So unless the patient was just admitted, they have the chance of knowing who that peer support specialist is and trusting them. Also, the peer support debriefer participates in treatment planning, in the formal debriefing, acts as an advocate for the client and treatment plan, and looks at human rights issues as they arise. Next slide. So here's some real examples. Sam, 27-year-old male, was admitted to an inpatient unit because he was wandering around downtown Wilmington, Delaware. He was looking very intimidating to people. The police were called. On further assessment, he was known to the police, and he was arrested for public urination. He was sent to jail, and they immediately noticed that he was kind of hypomanic, and he was sent to a mental health facility on day 2. Sam asked how long he had to be there. He'd been in and out of that facility before. No one could tell him. They also took away his iPod. So again, he was, was on day 2, and this facility had a rule that you had to go to group activities on day 2. So he went, he got up in the middle of the group activity. Male staff moved over to him and told him to sit back down, and he had to stay. He got upset, he pushed over a table, and he got restrained. Even though the table actually hadn't threatened anybody, no one was sitting at it. But he scared people and he got restrained. What should have happened? Next slide. So when we went and debriefed, many of us around the table knew his admission history. We knew that he had a trauma history where he'd been verbally and physically abused by his dad. We knew from his mom, who had told us a million times that if Sam started to get upset, to not have men go deal with him, to send women staff, that he had never, ever gotten violent with a woman. We also knew from Sam and his mom that music was one of his main calming strategies. We knew that he was hypomanic and he hadn't slept in weeks, and he'd been off his meds, and he was probably or could possibly have been using some kind of drugs when he was in the street. And we did not know that our staff involved in that situation, who were relatively new, thought they were just to enforce the rules. Next slide. So we changed a lot of policies there, as you can imagine. That was one of the first really good debriefings that I was involved in my career, and really opened up to me how important debriefing was. Here's another one. Julie, 56. She was brought to a psychiatric admission office by the police after acting strange at the grocery store. She seemed disoriented and angry. She said that store staff had taken her credit card and wouldn't give it back. She was sent to the local emergency room and repeated this story three times. She was ignored by the emergency room staff. She went there to get medical clearance. This hospital emergency room had unwritten safety practices where all psych patients were restrained to gurneys in the emergency department if they were confused. No one came in to talk to her. They transferred her back to the psych facility, and by then she was really agitated and her mouth was drooping. And eventually workup showed that she had a stroke, and she sued for poor care. Next slide. This is another really good example of what we found out in debriefing. Emergency room staff are often not trained in behavioral health disorders. They often discount or ignore statements made by people brought into their care, especially if they look like people with behavioral health disorders, and to give them some, to give them a break. I mean, emergency room staff are constantly dealing with life and death emergencies, people that are bleeding, people that have broken arms or legs. And it's very unfortunate that in many of our states and many of our counties in this country, a lot of people with behavioral health end up sitting in emergency rooms where they really don't get adequate care. So this is a really clear issue for many of us. We should always pay attention to patients regardless of their diagnoses. And we, need to retrain staff that discount what folks say. It's pervasive across this country. Still, next slide. Greg, 36 years old. He was admitted with depression and substance abuse disorder. He grew up in South Carolina. He'd been intermittently homeless, lost his job, had problems managing his emotions. His wife filed for divorce and he became suicidal and he was admitted to a hospital. On the 4th day of inpatient, he walked over, looks completely unprovoked to everybody sitting around, walked over to a smaller, younger man who was sitting in a chair in the day room. And without saying a word, he punched this other guy 3 times in the face and he walked away. Well, the staff were in an uproar. They went after the nurse and demanded that Gregory be put into seclusion. They said he should be punished, that he couldn't just get away with that. So she put him in seclusion. She got an order to put him in seclusion. And so then we did a debriefing. And there we found out that after Gregory was admitted, he was very quiet and he really wasn't causing any problems and he was mostly staying in his room. So he was just put on checks for withdrawal signs and suicidal ideation. No one really interacted with him. No one really found out what his personal story was. There was no peer staff at this facility. And then in retrospect, we found out that he had told 3 different staff members that this other male client was in a gang, that he knew him, and that he was threatening him. And he told staff this, and the 2 staff he told said they ignored it, and the other staff said, "You're way bigger than him, so don't worry about it." And because of that, Gregory decided to take measures into his own hands, and that's why he attacked this gentleman. And he did what he thought he should do, and he went back to his room. Another learning here was that since he's no longer a danger, why are we secluding or restraining him? This happens. People punch people and they walk down to their room. Yes, that should be addressed in a treatment team, absolutely. But you don't go after them and then seclude and restrain, because that is a punishment. And we're not allowed to punish people, and we should never even try. Another example, Donnie, 23 years old, was admitted to an inpatient service. He was noted to be agitated, psychotic, and responding to internal stimuli. All these assessments found the same, all his hospital admission assessments found the same symptoms. He was admitted to a room, Staff mostly left him alone, except for to get meals and meds and to prompt him to go to groups, but he refused. 3 days went by, and then Donnie came out of his room and attacked staff. Medical record states Donnie came out of his room and attacked staff for no reason. He was placed in restraint for 1 hour. What should have happened? Next slide. He had a very chaotic life. This is what we found out during debriefing. He was abandoned by his parents, who were drug addicts and were not there for him. He was removed from his home at 6 years of age and put in foster care. He had 5 foster home placements, running away from some. He was and is of mixed race and was bullied all through school. All this information was provided on admission or a few days afterward. None of this information made it into the treatment plan. No hospital staff dealing with Donnie really understood the serious trauma history of this young man. Nobody really understood that he needed careful engagement and support, and that he was terrified to be in the facility. Nobody was individually assigned to Donnie to try and get to know him, to try and learn his story. And he was treated just like everybody else. And this event could have probably been avoided if we would have approached Donnie in a very different manner. So we put in place a number of changes, including assigning staff to people for the first 1 to 2 days of their admission, until we knew that they were comfortable, oriented, and knew how to get help if they needed help. Next slide. Next slide. So post debriefing treatment plan revisions, CMS and Joint Commission now expect us to look at the treatment plan after there is an event. And that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to change the treatment plan, because you may have just changed it and you might want to give it some time. But you do definitely need to integrate any information you learn from debriefing processes. So comments such as, if they only let me make a phone call, I wanted to listen to music and they were telling me to go to my room, staff were yelling and I got angry and scared, no one paid any attention to me, I couldn't find anybody to talk to, I had to get out of there, my dog had no one to feed him. Those are really important and critical pieces of information that should affect and inform the treatment plan. So that said, next slide. For some clients, calming and safety plans can be developed, and that is a very important step to do, especially as early in admission as you possibly can. Also, excellent customer services need to surround your admission processes into your treatment processes. Because if you can build trust and engage with people coming in so that they feel cared about and safe, then they're much less likely to hurt you. Offering snacks, just sitting nearby, asking what the person needs, every time walking by the room saying, how are you doing? Are you having a good day? Can I do anything to help? All those things are customer service competencies. And we have a lot of control over that and how we work those into our facilities. Next slide. In terms of operational revisions on the executive level, these are just some examples of hospital leadership changes in policy after debriefings were done for individual events. Staff can now allow a child to leave a group and swing on a swing in the recreation area. This will avoid a potential seclusion restraint event. Patients that want to use the phone for personal reasons can use them at any time, unless this is demonstrated to be a pattern over time, and then the treatment team will handle it. Staff will be assigned to each new admission and expected to engage. And staff are measured on their competencies to engage with assigned individuals. To be perfectly honest, therapeutic engagement with the people we serve is a mandatory competency for behavioral health staff. We don't get to say, well, I like to work with people that are depressed, but I don't really like to work with people that are psychotic. That's not how it works. We are, paid professionals, whether you have a degree or a title or whatever, we are all paid professionals and are expected to have some pretty mandatory competencies here. One of those is engagement, therapeutic use of self, and learning how to negotiate, mediate, and de-escalate well. Next slide. Other changes that were made by a variety of different hospitals, especially hospitals that use a lot of per diem staff. They made a decision that whenever possible, the per diem temporary staff would go back to the same units every single day they worked, so that there would be more continuity of care, not just be assigned as a body to an empty space on a gap in staff on a unit, that they really be treated as regular staff and that we try and use them smart, not just to fill in gaps. One hospital noted that their unit became more acute between day and evening shift coverage. And so they rescheduled an FTE to provide cross shift coverage from noon to 8 every day, because they noticed that a lot of their restraints and seclusions were happening between 2 and 4, when old staff were getting ready for report, the new staff were coming in the door, and people are coming and going, and everything gets a little bit chaotic. Another facility made sure that they had ready access to bilingual and bicultural interpreters who could get in there really quickly, and not just rely on the language line. And that also for hospitals that are located in sites that serve folks where English is not the primary language, this is critically important. Next slide. So in summary, debriefing, when we look at debriefing, we want to immediately think about putting in our policy, doing an immediate post-event analysis. Right after the event occurs, it's usually 15 to 20 minutes. Gathering that information in real time, trying to avoid groupthink, and getting that information to the supervisor that's on, and sending that information through shift report till the following day, and it can be addressed in the morning meeting. The next is also to do the formal debriefing the next working day, make sure that we're addressing physical and emotional needs of everyone that was involved, and getting enough information to be able to document the story of what happened. Next slide. Make sure you do a consumer debriefing. If you go in and the person basically says, get the F out, send someone else in an hour later. You never know when the consumer might be able to feel better and might be able to talk. Also try and send in someone to do a debriefing with the person who was not involved in the event, which can be very difficult. Offer an apology. I'm sorry this happened. What can we do so this never happens again? And then use that information to make clinical and administrative changes. Next slide. Must include executive management somehow. And obviously, the best way to do this is at a morning meeting where these events are discussed every single day for 15 minutes, whatever happened the last 24 hours. Assignments can be made, learning can be discussed, treatment plan revisions can be discussed, issues that happen on a specific unit environment, unwritten rules that staff may have tried to enforce, training necessary that we didn't know about, that we have certain staff that need more training just to help them get more competent, etc. Next slide. Assure that the feedback loops are closed. That's the biggest issue on debriefing, is it takes us from the event to closure. And use consumer and family advocates to assist in debriefing procedures if you're lucky enough to have them. Next slide. Just a final comment. This came out of our Tennessee delegation in 2003 during our first round of training, and I really love this quote. Excellence is the result of caring more than others think is wise, asking more than others think is safe, dreaming more than others think is practical, and expecting more than others think is possible. And I think that kind of categorizes the whole issue of trying to get a handle on the use of seclusion and restraint. Thank you. Next slide. Okay, so I'm gonna go, and so hold your questions. I'll be done in about 10 minutes and we can do that. But I'm going to outline kind of what goes into developing a prevention plan for seclusion and restraint using the 6 core strategies. To talk a little bit about the essential parts of the plan, obstacles to success, a little bit of an example of a plan, and you'll have access to this information, obviously, after the training is over. Next slide. So when you're planning to reduce seclusion restraint, you want to basically have an organized process and plan, or people won't know what to do and everybody will be running around doing different things, and it'll be very hard to manage and it probably won't result in much change. Needs to be, first off, led by an executive leader. It doesn't have to be the CEO, but it has to be someone with authority and who has a formal title. Again, remembering leadership as the most critical core strategy. This is one of the reasons, is only the leader can make sure that this process goes forward and is done thoughtfully, and that the people involved in developing the plan have power and authority. So the first thing you want to do is assign a group of people to this task force, or you can call it a work group, or you can call it a PI team. But this is the team, this is the committee that is going to develop the plan, implement the plan, monitor the plan, and then make changes as they go forward to the plan. It should involve at least one member of every discipline in the facility. So we're talking direct care staff, including mental health techs, a nurse, peer support specialist, activity therapist, a social worker, psychologist, physician, security staff person, quality improvement staff person, somebody from the training office, and just about everybody you can think of, maybe possibly not business office, but we've even had business office people involved. Facility manager, because the facility manager is the first person to get really upset when people start breaking things. And their budget starts being impacted, and they need to understand that we're not going to necessarily restrain or seclude when someone breaks something. We want staff representatives from senior, middle management at the meeting. And then we also, if we have a longer term facility, you can include patients. If you are working in a more acute setting, we want your peer mentors, somebody to be there. Next slide. So the project team gets a direction from the chair of the committee, whoever that is, and it needs to be someone who's pretty skilled and informed about this process. That team chair, that seclusion and restraint prevention team chair, reports directly to the CEO as they go forward. It's best if someone like the assistant director of the facility or someone in that C-suite actually chairs this team, especially to start. The plan is developed under a prevention approach umbrella. We use principles of performance improvement to develop the plan, understanding right up front that we're going to make mistakes. We're going to implement something or change a rule that's not going to work, and we're not going to blame anybody about it. And then we're going to pick the 1 or 2, most 3 of the 6 core strategies that we're going to work on first. And we're going to use those to develop a goal for each. So a goal on leadership, let's say a goal on leadership, a goal on data, and a goal on workforce. And we're going to then take the training, develop objectives and action steps, completion dates, and the name of the person who's going to be responsible to report back. So as you can see, this is very much like a treatment plan. The problem statement is violence and how to reduce it. We have provided you with a planning template where we have taken the 6 core strategies, made them into goal statements, and listed underneath a menu of activities, objectives, and action steps you can choose from to individualize this plan for your facility. You can also make up your own. Again, just take on 2 to 3 of the strategies first. Choose some things that are what we call low-hanging fruit, so you can see some success early on. And in general, I would always include leadership and data as at least one or two of your first goals. Next slide. Set up routine and consistent team meetings once a week to start. Take minutes of those meetings, just like you do with the treatment team. Hold responsible parties who are named in the treatment plan for their work, and they're reporting back to the team, obviously with some understanding. People get busy, but if you're responsible for that particular goal or objective, you need to be, on top of that and be able to report back when that meeting occurs. Revise due dates as necessary. Again, delays occur. Add or change team members as needed, and routinely inform the director of the facility or the CEO of the hospital on what is happening and what you are learning as you go forward. That's also a time to ask them for resources if you need additional resources, for instance, a budget for sensory items or a refrigerator, a patient refrigerator where you can stock it, put it in the middle of the day room, and people can go up and get something to eat or drink anytime they feel like it. So your staff don't have to constantly get up and manage those kinds of things. So just in summary, when we look at the 6 core strategies, we're looking at leadership toward organizational change, which really talks about the roles and responsibilities of both the formal and informal leaders in the facility, using data to inform our practices. So that means we're going to be tracking and collecting baseline and core variables, and then we're going to be graphing it and posting it all over the place so that everybody in the whole facility, including the patients, knows that we are focused on this work. And whoever's doing your graphing, your actual the actual printed document that's to inform staff and anybody else on where you are at in preventing the use of seclusion restraint. This information needs to be clearly presented. You should not need to have a degree in statistics to read a data chart in your hospital. It should be as simple and clear as possible. Under workforce development, we're talking about staff education and training. We're talking about human resources, interviewing, hiring components, onboarding, expected competencies, how we supervise, and performance evaluations. And we're also talking about witnessing, which is elevating the oversight of seclusion and restraint events and changing the roles and responsibilities of high-level leaders all the way down through direct care staff. Use of seclusion and restraint prevention tools includes assessments on admission, including risk factors for injury, developing safety or soothing plans, looking at our environment of care to minimize coercion, minimize anxiety and maximize safety, sensory approaches, minimization of rules, especially unwritten rules, fading point and level programs, really paying attention to our language, and reframing our attitudes toward troubling behavior as the person is doing the best that they know how to in the current circumstances. For the inclusion of adults and youth in our settings, we're going to want to look at specific roles, hiring people to come in. Some hospitals have a robust volunteer program, but most of the time people expect to be paid for this work. We want to look at peer support staff on staff, at least 2 at all times. Being the only peer support staff in an organization is an incredibly difficult place to be. And so peer support should usually always be hired with a minimum of 2. And they should report to a fairly high-level staff person who understands clearly what a peer support staff's scope of practice is, what it is and what it is not, because what has happened over time and over the years so way too often is that peer support staff are assigned to, just like a person that works, let's just say, in the activity area, or nursing area. And what ends up happening if the supervisor does not understand what they do is they end up being assigned to work as an activity therapist or a mental health tech. And that is not what peer support does. you got to have them supervised by people who really understand that role. And then debriefing techniques, daily meeting to review all events with senior leaders, staff debriefing and consumer debriefing competencies, which need to be reviewed annually, like all of our other competencies. We need to make sure our policy is well defined in terms of the roles and responsibilities of staff. And we need to make sure we have clear feedback loops. Next slide. There's no one right way to do this. The organization needs to individualize it to their own place. Again, write it like you are the treatment team and the facility is the consumer, the facility being the structure where seclusion and restraint takes place. Make it measurable and outcome based. Organize a rollout. A lot of people have a big party when they roll out this plan and try and make it fun for everyone, and then communicate. This is one of those situations where you'll see changes start to occur, and these changes need to be communicated up and down the organization pretty much on a daily or every other day basis, or people will not know what is going on. Next slide. Obstacles. No real senior leadership involvement. Everything gets delegated, so nothing much happens. We leave out the patients and the families. We leave them out of the whole process, so we don't really engage with them. We don't learn what they need, and we don't take advantage of their wisdom on experiencing our services, which is a lot of wisdom and a lot of really good information to get. We don't use data, or we hide the data. We don't review the use of seclusion restraint every 24 hours, but maybe once a month. And when we do that, the people that are reviewing that data are sitting in the performance improvement office. They are not direct care staff. They are separated from what's actually happening on the units. So the data has less meaning to everybody. Seclusion restraint continues to be handled just like a normal event that happens, and so we don't do anything differently about it, and so nothing's likely to change. If you do the same thing over and over again, nothing is likely to change. Another really critical issue is that staff are told by senior leaders don't use seclusion restraint, but nobody gives them any skills to change their behavior or to add tools to their toolbox. And like we heard earlier today, there are literally hundreds of tools that we can use to avoid the use of seclusion restraint. And then finally, no senior leader is watching the use of seclusion and restraint daily and involving the other parts of leadership to get a handle on this stuff. Next slide. Staff, consumers, and advocates recognize the rules that are causing conflict, but nobody seems to have the power to change those. Poor communication, individual staff who are directly opposed to preventing seclusion and restraint think that seclusion restraint is fine to use, or they're ambivalent about it, are not monitored or supervised or trained or held accountable. These are staff that no matter how much training you provide and how much role modeling and coaching, they still are the first one on the scene, the first one to be putting hands on people, and do not seem to understand that that's not what we want to do anymore. And these are folks that after you've done everything you possibly can, probably need to be encouraged to take their gifts and graces to work in other places. Another gap would be if there's no reward or recognition system for staff that demonstrate best practices, staff that are excellent in de-escalating conflicts, staff that have the courage to bring concerns to supervisors, like rules that cause conflicts all the time that the direct care staff have to manage. We put direct care staff sometimes in dangerous harm's way because we've come up with some rule that no one really thought through, and they have to enforce it. And that's just basically not fair and not smart. Next slide. So use the seclusion the one we gave you, the template, the 6-course strategy plan template as a menu and adapt it. Try and review your progress weekly, at least at the beginning. Revise the plan over time. And if you don't do this already, have a discussion about just doing a daily meeting right at the beginning of the day 15 minutes to find out what happened the last 24 hours and if anything needs to be followed up, and what was learned. Next slide. Keep record of obstacles that help or hinder, in the successes that help and the obstacles that hinder you moving forward. Keep the plan manageable. Know you will make mistakes. Know this is a process, not a race, and enjoy it. It's really fascinating what often happens in facilities when you start to peel this onion. And I can tell you, I did my dissertation on this process, and I did it in Massachusetts. And the staff that I interviewed, a number of them talked about the fact that it was like the facility was an onion and they were peeling the onion. And every time they peeled the onion, they learned something new about their facility, their hospital, that helped inform changes to be made. And that metaphor is constantly kept in my head. So thank you very much for your time today. And we now have about 12 minutes for questions.
Thank you for both of those, Kevin. They're both so important.
So questions, guys, time to speak up. All you smart people out there.
Oh, Minta, does she still have her hand raised?
Yes.
Okay.
Always, unfortunately. So I have a question about workforce development. So some of the things you talked about today, we expect staff to have all these mandatory competencies, which are pretty direct care staff, which are pretty advanced, right? Being able to work with, understand, put yourself in the shoes in people who have a variety of mental health struggles, a variety of trauma experiences, being able to regulate your own emotions, being able to make good judgment, being able to know when and where to report things, being observant, doing that for 8 hours a day with very little break time. And so the thing about that, I have a question is, so I don't know how it is in other states, but in Massachusetts, right, as far as I know, there aren't like any sort of vocational certification programs for people who want to become direct care staff specifically in mental health. I know you could, maybe get a CNA or a home health aide, but there's no, education or training formally for direct care staff. And then, we are of course responsible for training our own staff, and that's very important. I participated in that, so I know, but a lot of these skills are things you can't cover in a week-long orientation training. You can't teach somebody emotional regulation in a week. You can't teach somebody how to not take things personally in a week. And even if they sit there and have this experience, they all nod and agree and fully understand and pass your assessment and everything in the training. When they get in the milieu, all their life experience is way larger than and any training that you could ever possibly give them. So my question is sort of, how and where are we supposed to find these people that come in with all these skills if there's no formalized training for them outside of our programs, and we are time limited in how we train them in our programs?
Okay. So the first is, remember when I talked about the new applicant interview?
Mm-hmm.
You need to really take that opportunity to ask some behavioral interviewing questions to immediately off the bat get an idea of whether or not that person is able to make good judgments in emergency situations. Because yes, you are, it is very, what we expect are not things that people are born with, but you also need to avoid hiring people that have significant self-regulation issues. That's a big problem. And so you ask questions like during the interview, okay, Minta, so you want to come work here as a mental health tech. So I'm going to ask you a question. You come to work, your third day of work, and you're coming in and it's after shift report, and you go out to start making rounds, and one of the patients goes up to another patient and slaps that patient across the face. What would you do? Okay, that's a behavioral health interviewing question.
Right.
There's no right or wrong answer there, but you will get an idea of what that person's emotional response will be. So that's just one piece. Second piece is you put in, when you start to drill down on all those competencies, it does sound pretty complicated. But if you put things in your job description that the mental health tech or the nurse or whoever will demonstrate compassion and empathy in interactions with clients, that becomes a little bit more simpler to assess. Because again, if someone doesn't, and that's another question to ask in a new hire interview. Can you describe to me what you know about empathy and what does that mean? I'm gonna tell you something. I did my own personal kind of little research performance improvement thing here. And I think I might have mentioned this training, but I'm just going to bring it up again. I go to Walgreens, and I went to Walgreens to pick up my medication about 2 years ago during COVID. And I went into Walgreens, and somebody yells across the room, "Welcome to Walgreens." And I was like, huh? Who the hell was that? And I'm thinking like, okay, I said hi. And when I left, they said, "Did you find everything you wanted? Can I be of any more help to you?" So that happened again and again. So then I went to another Walgreens just because I was in another part of town. The same exact same thing happened. I then went to all 6 Walgreens around Chapel Hill. The same thing happened. So here's an enormous organization who's hiring mostly high school students, who has somehow managed to train them to do the same thing in all of these different sites, probably all making minimum wage. I was pretty impressed. So it is doable. It is not easy. And I just also want to then go to your second part of your question. We could talk about this forever, and I'm happy to after the training. But the other piece is there is training for behavioral health, mental health technicians, and there are certification systems in place in other states. I don't know about Massachusetts, but I can tell you right now that the Florida Certification Board has done this nationally in a number of states. They have an entire curriculum. It's very similar to the peer certification program. They have a curriculum. I think it is about 40 or 60 hours where someone can actually, it's almost like a vocational training program, like a CNA. And I was a CNA. So it's very similar to that, like 2 weeks of training. You pass a test and it gives you some of those basic skills. So that's something I think you've got a senior leader sitting right here on our screen right now. So that's something that we could potentially talk about after the fact. I do not think this training is very expensive at all. And I think you bring up a very important and critical piece of information, a gap that needs to be addressed. So thank you.
All right, thank you very much. That's helpful. Thanks.
Laura?
Well, I was just going to comment on that. I think like trying to go back to a little bit of what, I'm sorry, her name's escaping me, but the last presenter, from Kitchens, who said, this is, this is not perfection, and we're always working on this. And I think that, with staff turnover, and I think for myself, I'm in the position right now where I am rebuilding a nursing team. COVID kind of disseminated that team that I had, but I often, with my recruiting, and I've had times where I'm like giving a tour, and I've had a nurse like halfway through the tour, and these are nurses, like, no, thank you, and ask to leave. So I really, very much like Kevin said, started, interviewing. One of the things, I work with adolescents. So I start right off, with why do you want to work with adolescents? Teens can be tough, typically, never mind, adding the mental health component. So, and I will always say, I need nurses. I am not looking to dissuade you, but this is not for everyone. Let's talk about what we do here. And then, yes, ask some give some scenarios and say, like, what would you do? And then I do think that, for myself, when I came to NFI, the thing that struck me and what I loved most was the training. It's what's kept me here, was that, my nurses are getting the same training as the gentleman who, is helping to clean our units, because we are all interacting with clients. And, this was, 9 years ago or 8 years ago, we are doing trauma-informed ARC model training. And we continue to model it, and you have to find those people who have that skill and then really, try to, get their buy-in to help with, the rest of your staff. So, and it's never, I don't think that we're ever going to be, you have retention issues, you lose people. It is always, I think, a flux up and down of where you're at in this. We're never in a perfect place. I think, but I definitely think, the key is in the recruiting and also, like Kevin has said, in your leadership, modeling who you are choosing to get out there. You can't just like train it once and walk away, and so often I will say we go along, we have a new nurse on the floor, something is happening, we're going to model, all of us together, myself included. I'm not sitting up in the office. We have to go model for one another. So thank you.
Thanks, Laura.
That was great input. Wonderful you're there. I think we probably needs to send it over to Dr. LaBelle for the closing.
And I just wanted to mention, Minta, thank you for that question. That was a really important question. It's actually made me really think about some things to add. So thank you.
Right.
Likewise, thank you, Minta, and thank you, everybody, because I do have a little information that there is, in fact, a credit and certificate program in the Massachusetts Community Health. It's called Community Health Worker in the community college system. There are a number of larger employers who will fund this and or recruit through this program. So it's called Community Health Worker. It's a credit certificate program in the Massachusetts system. So that's something to consider, but it's a really important question. And it also gets back to like one of the earlier pieces that, Beth Caldwell was talking about with Kathy Fuentes, who operated an IRTP, and Kathy, was in her 70s when she was the program director, but she said, give me a green staff any day of the week, and I will train for skill. And it also is not just train for skill, but supervise. That's the other thing. We don't expect people to have every single competency. And as soon as we train them in their 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks orientation, that comes over time, and we invest in the workforce. So fabulous question. Perfect, really, because what we said right at the outset of this training, and as we prepped everybody for it, that we are in a rebuilding, starting over, regrouping, and going back to basics. So perfect question, perfect time. And I want to thank everybody for participating in this, but I have to specifically thank Dr. Huckshorn, Beth Caldwell. They are international leaders in the rollout of the core strategy curriculum, and they have been a real gift to Massachusetts. This is now our 7th or 8th. We still have to go back and do the official tally of the core strategy training, and we expect to have another training next year. We may do a hybrid, we may do in person, but it's critical to rebuilding and getting staff kind of retrained or getting new workforce exposed to this really important curriculum. So my specific and sincere thanks to them for being incredible faculty and the principal investigators of this approach. Also, thanks to Dana Remian, the soul of patience, and kind of organizing and rolling out with Donahue Institute and being our technology platform partners to make this possible. This was a fast pulling together of this training. So thrilled for them and their work. And also, if you like getting the free CEUs, always thank Christine Sullivan, because that's a big lift too. So thank you. And also to the faculty. You had the opportunity to see Dr. Tina Champagne, who, you cannot overstate her credentials and her qualifications. She is recognized internationally and been a fantastic partner and leader in this, and we are really grateful. But also to have, Ken Luder and Morgan and Michelle and Sam, fabulous faculty. So my real appreciation for their contribution to this training. My ask from all of this is that there's an expectation. Your time is important. We appreciate your dedication to this training, but there's an obstacle, a requirement that you take back this information, you do something with it. So for those programs that are funded, licensed by DMH, we have a requirement, they have a plan. You have a plan to reduce restraint and seclusion. And some of these plans are really dusty and old and probably not well versed. I say it's time to go back, take some of these fabulous pragmatic examples, embed them in your plans. We will be revisiting them. We will be work with our licensing partners, going back out to help people figure out what they need to be able to bolster their competence and get back in the sync, because we know that there's been real slippage in the practice of restraint and seclusion in our state. Also, just want to invoke Dr. Huckshorn's admonition at the very beginning. You know, if this can work at Bridgewater State Hospital, this can be achieved anywhere. And also Dr. Champagne, who said, where there's a will, there's a way. You just have to stick with it. So that's my wish for all of you. Please stick with it. Please dig in. We'll be happy to be partnering with you. Look forward to more trainings that we will be offering online, as well as in-person education as well. So thank you all. Fabulous job. And look forward to our next steps together. Thank you.
Yay, audience.